If you look at the global economy today, we are just constantly fed this narrative that it's this incredibly robust, infinitely resilient system.
Right, like it's bulletproof.
Exactly. Like we've spent the last 4 decades optimizing it, digitizing everything, building in all these supposed redundancies. But when you really get down to it, when you study the actual mechanics of how physical things move right now,
It doesn't look resilient at all.
no, not even a little bit. It doesn't look like a sleek digital network. It looks like a tightly wound, ridiculously overcomplicated antique mechanical clock.
That is honestly the exact architectural reality we're operating in today. I mean, you have thousands of these interlocking gears, and some of them are the size of massive cargo ships, right?
Yeah.
And others are literally the size of microscopic silicon chips. And they are all meshed perfectly together, just spinning at absolute maximum capacity to maintain this illusion, really, of seamless global commerce.
Right. And the terrifying thing about a mechanical clock is that you don't need to take a hammer to it to stop it from working.
No, not at all. Just one tiny piece of grit.
Exactly. If one tiny gear, like halfway across the board, catches a single piece of grit, that tension transfers instantly. The gears grind, the teeth shear off, and suddenly the hands on the face of the clock, which, might represent a factory in Bengaluru or a tech office in Silicon Valley, they just stop moving.
Yeah, because there are no isolated incidents anymore. The borders and the oceans that we historically relied on to sort of act as these massive shock absorbers for the world's problems,
Right.
they simply do not function that way anymore in a hyper-optimized supply chain.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Today is Saturday, March 15th, 2026. And our mission today is to essentially trace that exact transfer of mechanical tension.
Yeah, we have a massive stack of sources to get through today.
We really do. And they pull from all these highly disparate headlines of the moment. So for you listening, we are going to track the actual supply chain of global anxiety. We're going to start at the physical geopolitical choke points in the Middle East.
And then from there, we'll follow that friction as it sort of grinds into heavy industry shipping and then bleeds into consumer electronics.
Yeah, and how it fundamentally alters the physical reality of human labor and AI corporate culture. And finally, we're going to look at how society is just desperately seeking escapism from this exact systemic stress.
Because understanding this invisible architecture that connects all these seemingly random events, it's the ultimate prerequisite to being genuinely well-informed.
Right, because the headlines don't happen in a vacuum. The movement of a warship directly dictates, the cost of your groceries or the security of your job.
Even how you spend your weekend, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to start at the epicenter, the literal piece of grit that has just fallen into the gears. Because the core information from our sources today is severe.
It's very severe.
The United States has launched targeted strikes on military sites located on Kharg Island. And this was a direct retaliatory kinetic action following an Iranian strike on an island belonging to the United Arab Emirates.
Right. And to understand why the global markets immediately went into total hyperventilation over this specific headline, you really have to understand the geography here.
Okay, break that down for us. Why Kharg Island?
Well, Kharg Island isn't just some random outcropping of rock in the Persian Gulf. It is the beating heart of Iran's oil export infrastructure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the vast majority of all Iranian crude is pumped to this specific island, loaded onto these massive supertankers, and then sent out into the global market.
So by striking the military sites there, the U.S. message is completely unambiguous.
Oh, yeah. They're demonstrating that the economic jugular vein is well within target acquisition range.
But the Iranian countermove is what takes this from, a localized military exchange to a full-blown global systemic threat, right? Because Tehran has publicly stated that while their energy facilities are safe for now, they are openly threatening the wider Gulf's oil infrastructure.
Yes, and most critically, they are directly threatening the Strait of Hormuz.
Right,
The Strait of Hormuz is the single most vital and simultaneously the most vulnerable geographic choke point on the planet. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide.
Which already sounds narrow for international shipping.
It is, but it's actually much worse than that. The actual shipping lanes, the deep water channels that can actually accommodate these massive supertankers, those are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
Wait, 2 miles?
2 miles, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. That's it.
That is insane. You essentially have, what, a fifth of the world's daily oil consumption?
Roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day.
Trying to squeeze through a 2-mile wide dirt road. I mean, if you stall a vehicle in that specific intersection, the entire global energy gridlock is instantaneous.
Precisely. So when Iran threatens the Strait, they aren't just making a military threat. They are leveraging the physical geography to literally hold the global economy hostage.
Right.
They aren't just threatening the UAE or the U.S. They are threatening the energy security of massive manufacturing hubs in Asia, the heating infrastructure of Europe.
And the inflation metrics of basically every central bank on Earth.
Exactly.
Which brings us to perhaps the most fascinating political maneuver in this entire geopolitical chess match. U.S. President Donald Trump has issued a direct call to world powers. As this conflict is entering its third week now, he's explicitly demanding that China, Japan, South Korea, and the UK send their own naval ships to secure the shipping lanes in the Gulf.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
But wait, looking at the macro strategy here, isn't Trump's demand inherently contradictory? Because for years, the foundational doctrine of U.S. foreign policy in the Pacific has been the containment of Chinese naval expansion.
Right.
Like, we do not want them projecting blue water naval power. Yet here, the U.S. president is explicitly asking Beijing to deploy its warships into the Middle East, which is one of the most highly contested bodies of water on Earth. How does that make any strategic sense?
It's a massive strategic paradox. You're totally right. And it really highlights the intense friction right now between economic burden sharing and geopolitical hegemony. See, the domestic political appetite in the U.S. for unilaterally funding and enforcing the security of the global oceans, the global commons, that has just evaporated.
Because it's too expensive.
Yes. And the argument is basically China and Japan are the primary consumers of the oil flowing through Hormuz. So why should the American taxpayer underwrite the military fleet that guarantees Chinese energy security?
Oh, I see. So it's essentially a financial ultimatum.
It is entirely a financial ultimatum. But by making that demand, you are completely right, it invites a rival hegemon to establish a permanent security footprint in a region the U.S. has historically dominated.
Yeah, giving them a front row seat.
Right. It tests whether economic giants like China are actually willing to project hard power to protect their supply chains. And crucially, whether they're capable of integrating into a security architecture that the U.S. is inevitably going to try to coordinate.
Yeah.
It's a high-stakes gamble. It forces allied and rival nations alike to physically manifest their reliance on the global system.
And, of course, the anxiety generated by this, it doesn't just stay contained to international waters or high-level UN Security Councils. The moment a missile is fired, it immediately becomes domestic political ammunition.
It always does.
Like, for example, in India right now, the Prime Minister has publicly stated that the opposition Congress Party is actively attempting to create panic and basically leverage these global conflicts for political gain.
And it is absolutely imperative to state clearly here for our listeners that our objective is solely to analyze how geopolitical events are utilized as mechanical levers within domestic political ecosystems.
Yes, exactly.
We are just observing the translation of international friction into local political rhetoric. We are not endorsing the Prime Minister's characterization of the opposition, nor are we validating the opposition's underlying critiques. We're strictly neutral here.
100%. We are just looking at the blueprint of the shockwave. An explosion happens on Kharg Island, and within days it is a talking point in an election cycle thousands of miles away.
The speed of it is wild.
It is. But let's follow that ripple out of the abstract realm of politics and into the intensely physical world of heavy cargo, because this is where the theoretical concept of a quote-unquote supply chain disruption becomes incredibly tangible.
Yeah, a physical logistics network is where the panic truly sets in. So right now, navigating through that exact 2-mile-wide shipping lane we just discussed, there are 2 India-bound ships, the Shivalik and the Nanadevi.
Okay.
And combined, these 2 vessels are carrying 92,700 metric tons of LPG, liquefied petroleum gas.
See, to put the sheer mass of that into perspective for you listening, 92,700 metric tons of LPG isn't just a commodity on a spreadsheet. It is literally the baseline social stability of a nation.
It really is.
This is the cooking gas that fuels millions of domestic households.
Yeah.
If that supply is delayed or, God forbid, targeted, the immediate domestic fallout is just catastrophic.
Which is exactly why the administrative response in India has been so aggressive. The sources show that these 2 specific ships are being granted priority berthing at the Mundra and Kandla ports.
Now, explain the mechanics of priority berthing for a second, because port logistics, are usually this incredibly rigid, immovable queue, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Normally, a port operates on a strict, pre-scheduled timetable. Ships arrive, and they wait at anchorage for days, sometimes weeks, paying massive daily demurrage fees just waiting until a berth opens up.
Right.
So priority berthing means the state authority steps in, completely overrides the commercial queue, and mandates that the dock be cleared immediately for these specific vessels.
So they just cut the line.
They cut the entire line. The government is absorbing the logistical chaos and the financial penalties of delaying all that other commercial cargo just to ensure that this specific critical energy supply is offloaded the exact second it touches the coast.
Wow.
It is an extreme break glass in case of emergency bureaucratic maneuver.
And it's not even limited to energy, is it? We see a similar clearance happening on the eastern seaboard with 25,000 metric tons of borates, which is a mineral crucial for industrial drilling, being aggressively cleared at Kakinada port.
Yeah, the urgency is everywhere.
But the physical friction of this conflict isn't just hitting the seaports. It is immediately hitting the airports and, by extension, the consumer's wallet.
Yeah, the aviation sector honestly provides the clearest, most immediate window into how geopolitical risk is priced in real time.
Let's talk about the airlines.
So Akasa Air has just announced they are joining Air India and Indigo in levying a direct fuel surcharge on passengers. Depending on the duration of your flight, you're looking at an additional 150 to 1,300 rupees per sector added directly to the cost of your ticket.
The speed at which that happens is just breathtaking to me. Like, a missile strikes in the Middle East, and literally 48 hours later, a family flying to a wedding in India is paying a Strait of Hormuz conflict tax on their boarding pass.
Well, the underlying economics of aviation completely dictate that speed. You see, aviation turbine fuel, or ATF, has spiked by 30 to 40% strictly due to these West Asia tensions.
40%.
Yeah, and for an airline, fuel is not some peripheral cost. It is often the single largest line item in their operating expenses. Sometimes it accounts for up to 40% of their total costs.
And their margins are already tiny.
Right. Notoriously razor thin. So when your primary input cost jumps 40% overnight, you do not have the financial buffer to absorb it. The profit margin instantly goes negative.
So they just pass it on.
They have to. The only survival mechanism is an immediate, ruthless pass-through of that cost to the retail consumer. That pushes overall ticket prices up by 15 to 20% immediately.
Which creates a really fascinating contrast in how different entities handle these systemic shocks. Because while the private airlines are instantly passing the pain to the consumer, the government is taking the exact opposite approach in the agricultural sector.
Right, very different strategy.
Yeah, because India's Department of Fertilizers is actively issuing global tenders to procure spot LNG right now.
And this really highlights the fundamental difference in their mandates. Spot LNG, for those who don't know, refers to liquefied natural gas purchased on the open market for immediate near-term delivery.
Right.
This is entirely different from long-term, multi-year supply contracts where the price is relatively stable. In the middle of a geopolitical crisis, the spot market is incredibly volatile and punishingly expensive.
So why is the Department of Fertilizers willingly wading into the most expensive energy market in the world right now?
Because of the chemistry of agriculture and the completely unforgiving timeline of the seasons.
What do you mean by the chemistry?
Well, LNG isn't just a fuel source used to power a fertilizer factory. It is the actual chemical feedstock.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, the methane in the natural gas provides the hydrogen that's necessary to synthesize ammonia, which is then converted into urea. And the Kharif season, which is the critical monsoon crop season, is rapidly approaching.
So there is a hard, biological, non-negotiable deadline. You can't just tell the farmers to delay planting their crops until the global spot market cools down.
Exactly. A private airline's mandate is quarterly shareholder value, so they pass the cost on. A sovereign government's mandate is food security.
Right, the stakes are totally different.
If the Department of Fertilizers balks at the high spot prices, the urea doesn't get manufactured. If the urea isn't distributed, the Kharif crop yield collapses. A collapsed harvest triggers massive rural economic devastation, hyperinflation in food prices, and profound political instability.
So the state just eats the cost.
Yes. They make the calculated decision to absorb massive financial pain up front on the global spot market just to guarantee physical supply and domestic stability. It is the ultimate exercise in state-level crisis management.
It's just a profound realization that the complex chemistry of keeping a billion people fed is entirely tethered to the physical security of natural gas shipments passing through an active war zone.
It really makes you think about how fragile it all is.
But as we move from the cargo to the human element, the reality gets even grimmer, frankly, because the supply chain isn't just made of steel containers and liquefied gas, it's built on human capital. And right now, that human capital is in total paralyzed flux.
Yeah, the maritime workforce is perhaps the most invisible, yet most essential demographic in the global economy.
We never think about them.
Never. But over the last 15 years, India's maritime workforce has experienced this explosive five-fold growth. We are now looking at 323,000 Indian seafarers. That constitutes a massive 12% share of the entire global maritime workforce.
These are the people physically steering the ships, maintaining the massive engines, navigating these tiny choke points, and our sources detail a genuinely horrifying reality today.
Yeah.
Currently, 23,000 of these Indian seafarers are effectively trapped in the Persian Gulf region.
It just exposes the raw vulnerability of a globalized blue-collar workforce. These individuals are physically exposed to the kinetic crossfire of international disputes. They are literally sitting on massive, highly flammable floating targets in a hot conflict zone.
I can't even imagine the stress.
The psychological toll on those crews and the panic calls flooding back to their families in India that represents the acute human cost of this geopolitical friction. Their physical survival is the prerequisite for that seamless global trade network we discussed earlier.
But the disruption to human capital isn't solely physical danger, is it? Because it takes on a completely different, much more bureaucratic form when we look at their white-collar counterparts, the global student population.
Oh, the student demographic is seeing a massive shift right now.
Yeah, a massive demographic of Indian students are currently hitting pause on their entire overseas study trajectories.
The friction here is really a compounding crisis. It's partly the global unrest, obviously, and just the general anxiety of leaving home during a period of massive global instability.
Makes sense.
But it's also a structural, bureaucratic wall that's being erected by the traditional Anglosphere destinations. We are seeing significantly stricter visa policies, increased financial proof requirements, and tightening post-graduation work rules being aggressively rolled out across the U.S., Canada, Australia, and the U.K.
This feels like a monumental shift to me. For decades, the default aspiration for top-tier Indian talent was, a master's degree in the US or the UK. But if those doors are closing or the process becomes just too hostile, that intellectual capital doesn't just evaporate.
No, it just reroutes.
Exactly. And the data shows exactly where it's rerouting. Students are pivoting rapidly toward the European Union. They're establishing Germany, Spain, and Italy as primary alternative destinations.
And we're also seeing that the UAE, which had been really growing as an educational hub, is seeing a temporary but very sharp dip in applications.
Just because of how close they are to the West Asia conflict zone.
Entirely due to geographic proximity, just perceived as too risky right now.
We really need to pause and think about the long-term 10 to 20-year implications of this. I mean, if you're listening to this, imagine an entire generation of Indian engineers, medical students, and business majors who are effectively diverted from Massachusetts or London.
Right.
And instead, they spend their formative academic and early professional years in Munich or Madrid or Milan. How does that change the economic wiring of the next decade?
It rewires the global economy at its most foundational level.
How so?
Because the flow of students is the leading indicator for the flow of future capital and innovation. Where students go, alumni networks take root.
That's very true.
And where alumni networks exist, cross-border startups are founded, institutional research partnerships are formed, and bilateral trade agreements are eventually negotiated between those countries.
So it's planting seeds.
Exactly. Take Germany, for instance. They offer heavily subsidized, sometimes free tuition, and they have a massive, talent-starved industrial tech sector.
Yeah.
So a student who goes there masters the German language and integrates into their engineering culture today. They are laying the groundwork for a technological and economic bridge between India and the EU that entirely bypasses the traditional U.S.-centric model.
Wow.
We are witnessing the geographical center of gravity for future intellectual networks shifting in real time.
It's the butterfly effect on a massive macroeconomic scale. A visa policy change in Washington today creates a dominant tech corridor between Bengaluru and Berlin in 2040.
It's exactly that.
But let's pull the focus back from 2040 to right now. Let's look at how all this macro anxiety is just crushing the microeconomy. Let's talk about consumer electronics, specifically the smartphone market.
The smartphone is arguably the most complex consumer product in human history, and it is uniquely vulnerable to the exact supply chain frictions we've been outlining.
Because it requires pieces from everyone.
Exactly. And the market projections right now are incredibly grim. We're looking at a potential contraction of more than 13% this year alone.
And the underlying numbers explain exactly why. The cost of semiconductor chips is up anywhere from 15 to 40%.
40%?
Yeah. The memory supply chain is severely strained, and the consumer response is immediate. We saw a massive 35% collapse in demand in February.
And to understand why a microchip suddenly costs 40% more, you have to look at how it's actually built.
Walk us through it.
A single logic board might require silicon mined in one country, refined in another, printed in Taiwan, assembled with memory modules fabricated in South Korea, and finally packaged in China or Vietnam.
It's a world tour.
It is a product that crosses international borders dozens of times before it ever reaches a store shelf. So when the cost of ocean freight spikes due to the Hormuz tensions, and when air freight capacity is constrained, every single one of those border crossings becomes dramatically more expensive.
Right, because the fuel surcharges we talked about.
Exactly. The chip manufacturers are facing their own inflated energy and logistics bills, so they pass a 40% hike down the line.
And the smartphone brands have no choice but to bake that into the retail price. But the consumer, who is, already paying 20% more for their airline tickets and watching their grocery bills rise due to agricultural uncertainty, they simply balk.
Yeah, they just say no.
They look at a new phone that costs significantly more than last year's model but offers only, marginal improvements, and they make the totally rational economic choice to hold on to their current device for another 18 months.
That is what a 35% demand cliff looks like in practice.
It is the exact same mechanical transfer of tension happening in the automotive sector, too. Car manufacturers in India had set a highly optimistic target of 4.7 million sales for the financial year 26. But our sources are explicitly warning of a, quote, bumpy road ahead.
Yeah, because transportation costs for the automotive supply chain have risen by 10 to 15%.
Because of the freight bottlenecks?
Yes. The modern automotive industry operates on just-in-time manufacturing principles. They do not hold massive warehouses full of spare parts anymore.
Right, they rely on perfect timing.
Perfect timing. They rely on a perfectly synchronized, continuous flow of components arriving at the assembly plant exactly when they are needed. So when freight bottlenecks occur, that synchronization breaks down.
So what do? Just stop building cars?
Often, yes. Factories have to pause production, or they are forced to pay exorbitant premium rates to air freight heavy automotive parts just to keep the assembly lines moving.
Wow, air freight and car parts sounds incredibly expensive.
It's ruinous. A 15% structural increase in transportation costs completely obliterates the pricing matrix for a domestic vehicle. It forces the retail prices up and freezes the consumer right out of the market.
We have built a world that requires absolute frictionless perfection just to remain affordable.
We really have.
But, in the midst of all this highly advanced, incredibly tense logistical anxiety, our sources provided a detail today that is so absurdly, painfully human, it almost feels like a joke.
Oh, the tax department email.
Yes. At the exact moment when financial stress is peaking across the board for everyone, the income tax department accidentally blasted out an automated advanced tax error email to countless taxpayers.
Unbelievable.
They sent out a mass panic-inducing tax demand, realized they made an algorithmic error, and then had to frantically scramble to flag the emails and issue a correction telling everyone to ignore it.
It perfectly illustrates the friction of automated bureaucratic systems just failing under pressure. I mean, receiving a completely erroneous official government tax demand at the close of the financial year. That is the absolute apex of unnecessary cognitive load for a consumer who is already stressed by inflation.
The irony is just so rich to me. We have logistics networks so sophisticated they can track a single memory module on a ship in the middle of the ocean in real time. Yet the state tax apparatus accidentally hits reply all on a financial heart attack to thousands of citizens.
That's so clumsy.
We are a hyper-advanced civilization running on software that is still entirely comically clumsy.
Yeah, but this tension between human systems and automated algorithms, it actually leads us perfectly into what is happening inside the corporate world right now.
Because things are getting aggressive there.
Very. Because while consumers are pulling back on spending, major corporations are executing massive, violent, structural pivots.
And the most aggressive pivot is happening within big tech. The sources indicate that Meta is preparing for sweeping structural layoffs that could potentially affect 20% or more of their current workforce.
20%.
20%. And we need to be very clear about why this is happening. They aren't laying people off because their core business is failing or because they're going bankrupt.
No, not at all.
They are liquidating their human workforce specifically to fund massive capital-intensive investments in generative AI infrastructure. They are currently testing their Llama 4 models, and the capital required to do that is just astronomical. This directly mirrors the bloodbath we saw in November 2022 when they cut 11,000 staff.
And this represents a profound, permanent shift in the underlying philosophy of the technology sector.
How so?
Well, for the last 2 decades, the defining metric of growth and dominance for a tech giant was talent acquisition. Hoarding the smartest engineers and the most creative designers was the ultimate competitive moat.
Right. The perks, the free food, all to keep the talent.
Exactly. But generative AI has fundamentally altered the bottleneck to innovation. The constraint is no longer human intellect. The constraint is computational power.
The war for talent is over. The war for compute has begun.
Exactly. Training a model like Llama 4 requires tens of thousands of highly specialized, incredibly expensive GPUs running constantly for months. They consume massive amounts of electricity and cooling. The capital expenditure required to build those server farms is staggering.
So they have to find the money somewhere.
Right. Meta and companies like them are making the cold, algorithmic calculation that a rack of NVIDIA servers will generate vastly more future enterprise value than a department of mid-level human managers. They're literally firing the marketing and recruitment teams to buy more silicon and electricity. It is a structural wealth transfer from human payroll to raw computational infrastructure.
That is a deeply, deeply chilling realization. But let's look at the flip side of that coin. What about the people who survived the layoffs?
The ones left behind.
Yeah, what is the reality for the employees who get to stay and actually utilize these new AI tools? The sources give us a look into the reality of AI in the Indian workplace today, and it is far from the utopian vision we were all sold.
Oh, it's brutal.
We were told AI would give us our time back, but instead it is causing what the sources define as workload creep. Amit Khanna from Grant Thornton is quoted saying, "Productivity gains often make us a bit greedier."
The psychological dynamic of this workload creep is fascinating and honestly really insidious.
Break it down for us.
Well, the implicit promise of automation was the 4-day work week, right? The idea was simple. If a generative AI can draft a contract or analyze a spreadsheet in 10 minutes, a task that previously took you 3 hours, you have just reclaimed 2 hours and 50 minutes of your life.
Right. You coast. You take a long lunch, you go for a walk.
But the reality of corporate management fundamentally rejects that premise. When the friction of the task is removed by AI, the employer does not grant you the surplus time.
Of course not.
They simply recognize that your capacity for output has increased, and they flood that newly freed time with a denser volume of tasks. The sources show employees are now routinely working straight through their breaks, not because they are slower, but because the AI has removed the natural pauses and breathing room that used to exist within the workflow.
You know, I keep thinking about this like a bicycle. For years, the tech industry sold AI to us as a bicycle for the mind. It was a tool that would give us mechanical advantage. You pedal, but the gears do the hard work, allowing you to coast down the hills and enjoy the journey.
I love that analogy.
But what actually happened is that corporate management took that bicycle, bolted it firmly to the office floor, turned it into a stationary peloton, and just cranked the resistance knob up to maximum.
Yeah.
You are pedaling faster than ever before. You are producing way more watts of energy, generating vastly more output, but you aren't actually traveling anywhere new. You're just sweating infinitely more, staring at the exact same wall without ever getting to coast.
That perfectly captures the mechanical reality of the modern workday. The density of expectations is increasing exponentially. The cognitive load hasn't decreased. It has simply shifted from the slow execution of a single task to the rapid-fire management of an AI executing dozens of tasks simultaneously.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. The psychological toll of a relentlessly dense, break-free workday is the hidden, unpriced cost of this whole technological revolution.
But the corporate evolution isn't exclusively focused on software and layoffs, is it? There is a really fascinating counter-trend happening in domestic hardware and heavy industry right now.
Yes, there is.
Our sources highlight that TIDCO, the Tamil Nadu Industrial Development Corporation, is investing 25 crore rupees each into space tech startups, Rapti Energy, and Agnikul Cosmos.
And this is a crucial pivot toward sovereign technological resilience.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, we've spent the entire first half of this deep dive establishing how fragile the global supply chains are, from the Strait of Hormuz to the semiconductor transit routes.
Right.
So in that environment of structural uncertainty, state-level funding for domestic deep tech and space tech is no longer a luxury. It's not a prestige project anymore. It is a hardline national security imperative.
So they have to build it themselves.
Exactly. TIDCO's 25 crore investment is an explicit signal that the state intends to cultivate indigenous sovereign capabilities in advanced engineering. They are ensuring they aren't entirely reliant on the whims of international logistics for next-generation technology.
And we see that exact same instinct for sovereign resilience translating into the energy sector, too. The government has just announced amendments to the rules governing captive power plants, specifically designed to ease the compliance burden for heavy industry.
And the mechanics of a captive power plant are essentially the ultimate form of corporate off-gridding.
Off-gridding, like going off the grid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Heavy manufacturing requires massive, continuous, uninterrupted baseload power. If you are a steel plant or a chemical refinery, a momentary blip in grid power can ruin millions of dollars of product.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, as we discussed earlier with the spot LNG market, relying on the public grid exposes you to massive, unpredictable price volatility.
Right, those 40% spikes.
So by easing the bureaucratic friction to build these captive localized power plants, the government is actively encouraging heavy industry to decentralize. They are allowing corporations to build their own independent energy infrastructure to physically insulate their operations from the systemic shocks of the outside world.
It is the corporate equivalent of building a doomsday bunker. If the world outside is chaotic, you just generate your own power and close the doors.
Exactly.
And that primal desire to escape the chaos, to find a coping mechanism, is exactly what we see playing out on a deeply human level, too. Let's examine how society is actually attempting to process and survive the compounding stress of geopolitical threats, 40% inflation on airfare, and the relentless stationary bike workload of the AI era.
Yeah, because the human response to massive macro-level anxiety almost always manifests in the pursuit of highly localized micro-level comforts.
Right.
We're seeing a profound behavioral shift in how organizations attempt to manage the exact psychological burnout we just analyzed.
The sources outline a massive pivot in corporate culture, specifically within India Inc. The era of the grand, sprawling corporate offsite is dying.
It's totally dead.
Companies are actively moving away from generic luxury retreats at massive resorts. Instead, they are embracing much smaller, highly curated offsites. We are talking about activities like go-karting or group pizza-making classes.
Yeah, micro experiences.
Right. Companies like Accenture and InMobi are adopting these hyper-local micro-experiences, and the sources note these typically cost around 1,500 to 2,000 rupees per person.
This is a deeply pragmatic, almost psychological triage by HR departments. They are recognizing that a lavish, impersonal trip to a five-star hotel does absolutely nothing to cure the specific type of burnout generated by algorithmic workload creep.
It probably just makes it worse.
It does. A highly structured, formal luxury event often feels completely hollow and just adds to the performative stress of the employee. What a workforce starved for genuine human connection actually craves is unstructured play, authentic low-stakes interaction.
Exactly. You do not form a meaningful bond with your colleague while eating plated salmon and listening to the CEO give a PowerPoint presentation on quarterly synergies.
Definitely not.
You form a bond when the two of you accidentally set a pizza crust on fire, or when you are racing cheap go-karts and someone spins out into the tire wall. It's a desperate attempt to reintroduce chaotic, unoptimized play into a work environment that has been relentlessly sterilized and optimized by AI.
And crucially, at 1,500 to 2,000 rupees a head, it is a brilliant financial maneuver.
Oh, because it's so much cheaper.
Exactly. In an environment where companies are tightening budgets due to the inflationary pressures of shipping and energy we discussed, these micro-experiences offer high-impact psychological bonding at a fraction of the cost of a traditional luxury offsite. It is localized, cost-effective corporate therapy.
But the desire for escapism isn't confined to corporate team building. It is reshaping the leisure and hospitality industry in bizarre ways, particularly in the regions geographically closest to the geopolitical epicenter.
Yeah, look at the UAE hospitality sector.
The sources reveal that the ultra-luxury hotels in Dubai and Abu Dhabi are rolling out incredibly steep staycation discounts. They're offering up to 70% off for local residents.
And the economics driving this are fascinating and somewhat surreal. The data points out that average room rates have collapsed from 800 dirhams to roughly 400 dirhams. This is a direct, highly localized economic consequence of the war in West Asia.
Simply because the international tourists aren't coming.
Exactly. The entire financial model of these ultra-luxury properties relies on a constant influx of high-net-worth global tourists. When geopolitical violence erupts in the broader region, the international tourist makes the very rational decision to cancel their flight and vacation elsewhere. So occupancy rates plummet.
But you still have to run the hotel.
Right. A luxury hotel is a massive fixed cost asset. You still have to air condition the massive lobbies, you still have to filter the sprawling pools, and you still have to pay the immense staff required to maintain the illusion of opulence.
So they're just burning money.
It creates what you might call ghost town economics. They have this massive, empty infrastructure burning cash every single day.
So they have to pivot violently to the domestic market. They slash prices by 70% just to incentivize the locals to walk through the door, hoping they will at least buy dinner at the restaurant or book a massage at the spa just to offset the fixed operational costs.
That's the only way to survive.
It is incredibly profound how this systemic machinery operates. Global geopolitical fear translates directly into an empty hotel, which forces a half-price weekend at the Burj Al Arab for a local resident, while simultaneously forcing an overworked tech employee in Bengaluru into a budget-friendly pizza-making class just to maintain their sanity.
It's all connected.
Which brings us seamlessly to the ultimate historical institution of escapism. Because today, March 15th, 2026, is the day of the 98th Academy Awards.
Hollywood's biggest night. The absolute zenith of the global dream factory.
Yeah.
But the historical trivia provided in our sources proves that even the Oscars, the ultimate monument to escapism, they are entirely tethered to the harsh physical realities of the world.
The evolution of the event itself is staggering. The very first Academy Awards in 1929 was essentially a private dinner party. It lasted 15 minutes and hosted 270 people. Tonight, it is a globally televised multi-hour spectacle hosting 3,400 of the most powerful people in media.
That trajectory mirrors the evolution of the film industry itself, from a relatively niche domestic guild gathering into a dominant pillar of global soft power. It shapes cultural narratives and exports American influence worldwide.
But the detail that absolutely fascinated me, especially given our entire conversation today about supply chain fragility and physical materials, is what happened to the actual Oscar statuette during World War II.
Oh, this is a great piece of history.
During the war years, due to severe shortages of metals like bronze and gold, which were being aggressively diverted to the military-industrial complex, the Academy was forced to hand out Oscars made entirely of painted plaster.
Plaster Oscars. It's a stark physical reminder that no institution is immune to macroeconomic scarcity. When a global supply chain collapses, whether it's due to U-boats sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic in 1942 or missiles threatening supertankers in the Strait of Hormuz today, the physical artifacts of our culture are forced to adapt. A plaster Oscar is the literal physical manifestation of a society prioritizing survival and heavy industry over the luxury of prestige materials.
And speaking of the physical statuette, there is the legendary $1 rule. Winners cannot simply take their Oscar and auction it off to the highest bidder on the open market. They are legally bound to offer it back to the Academy first for the symbolic price of exactly $1.
That rule is a brilliant, aggressive legal mechanism designed to prevent the commodification of prestige.
How do you mean?
The Academy recognizes that if Oscars can be openly traded like stocks or commodities, their symbolic value collapses entirely. By enforcing the $1 rule, they forcefully decouple the immense cultural honor of the award from its underlying physical market value. They are legally mandating that the prestige remains priceless.
Let's run through some of the historical extremes this source is provided to because it highlights the massive scope of this industry. John Williams holds the record as the oldest nominee at 90 years old.
Amazing.
Christopher Plummer is the oldest winner at 82. And on the absolute other end of the spectrum, Tatum O'Neal remains the youngest winner in history, taking home the award at just 10 years old.
Wow.
Oh, and Greer Garson holds the somewhat infamous record for the longest acceptance speech, clocking in at an agonizing 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Those extremes really highlight a unique aspect of the film industry. It is one of the few global platforms where a 90-year-old composer and a 10-year-old actor are participating in the exact same ecosystem of cultural production.
But the Oscars aren't just a platform for self-congratulation, are they? They have historically been a vital stage for profound political friction.
Yes, the Marlon Brando moment.
Exactly. Brando famously refused his Best Actor Oscar for his role in The Godfather, specifically to protest the deeply problematic treatment and portrayal of Native Americans by the film industry and television.
Brando's refusal was an absolute watershed moment in cultural history. He understood the mechanics of attention perfectly. He took a podium that was designed purely for industry vanity and weaponized it, transforming it into a globally televised, unavoidable platform for political dissent.
Right in their faces.
Yes, he forced an audience that was seeking comfortable escapism to abruptly confront an ugly, uncomfortable political reality.
And that concept, the friction between individual conviction and powerful institutional systems, that mirrors a piece of domestic news we have today. The sources note that the Ministry of Home Affairs has just revoked the detention of activist Sonam Wangchuk.
Right.
Whether you are a Hollywood titan refusing a gold statue on global television or a climate activist leading a protest march for tribal safeguards in the Himalayas, the fundamental human drive to disrupt a complacent system remains identical.
It really does.
But
perhaps the single most relevant piece of Oscar history for our specific moment in 2026 is the rule the Academy instituted back in 2023 regarding artificial intelligence.
oh yes,
The Academy explicitly decreed that the use of AI will neither help nor harm a film's chances of winning.
Right.
But, crucially, they ruled that the degree of human authorship is what ultimately counts for eligibility.
And this brings our entire deep dive full circle. This is the exact same philosophical battle we discussed regarding the meta layoffs and the crushing workload creep in the Indian tech sector.
Exactly the same.
The Academy is desperately trying to draw a line in the digital sand. They are acknowledging that the tools of creation are becoming entirely automated, but they are insisting that art, the core product of their entire industry, must fundamentally remain a human endeavor. They are attempting to legally defend the premium value of the human soul in an era of infinite, frictionless AI-generated content.
They're basically stating you can use the machine to accelerate your workflow, but the machine cannot be the author of the idea.
But as we saw very clearly with Meta liquidating 20% of its human staff to buy more servers for Llama 4, the corporate world is vastly less romantic about the sanctity of human authorship.
They don't care at all.
The algorithm doesn't care about the soul. It only cares about the output.
Sad, but true.
All right, we have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. We started with kinetic military strikes in the Persian Gulf, traced the flow of energy into heavy agriculture, watched logistics costs crush consumer hardware, explored the algorithmic liquidation of human corporate talent, and ended with plaster statues and the philosophical defense of human art.
We really went everywhere.
We did. Now I want to challenge you. For the listener who is attempting to synthesize this massive, interconnected web of anxiety, I want you to distill this into actionable intelligence. Based strictly on the sources we've examined today, how does a long-term investor navigate this mechanical clock?
Okay. To navigate this environment over a 5 to 10-year horizon, an investor must internalize 3 overarching structural realities that govern 10 distinct developments. The first overarching theme is the hard reality of logistics and energy.
Okay, what's development 1 under that?
Development 1. Supply chain fragility is the permanent new normal. When we see freight costs for the auto sector jump 10 to 15% instantaneously, it proves that the era of frictionless, perfectly timed global shipping is suspended. Profit margins in manufacturing will be continuously squeezed by geopolitical bottlenecks.
Makes total sense. Development 2.
Development 2. Energy hedging is the ultimate survival metric. The government's proactive emergency maneuvers, buying exorbitant spot LNG to secure urea production, and clearing commercial docks for priority LPG berthing, that demonstrates that state-level energy security dictates who survives a crisis. Companies with locked-in, diverse energy sources will dominate.
Got it. Development 3.
Development 3. The aviation sector's fatal vulnerability. When ATF spikes 30 to 40% and airlines are instantly forced to levy 1,300 rupee surcharges, it reveals a complete lack of pricing power. Airlines are highly volatile assets, utterly exposed to macro shocks.
Which leads to development 4, right?
Yes. Development 4. The shift toward decentralized energy production. Ease compliance for captive power plants signals a profound trend where heavy industry will spend massive capital to build its own localized grids, actively escaping the unreliability of public utilities and global fuel markets.
So the physical world is fracturing, and the winners are the ones who can localize their supply and power. What is the second theme?
The second theme is the structural squeeze on tech and labor. Development 5. The generative AI capital drain. Meta cutting 20% of its staff to fund Llama 4 infrastructure signals a historic, ongoing wealth transfer. Capital expenditures shifting permanently away from human payroll and into server farms and raw compute power.
And Development 6.
Development 6. The greedy productivity paradox. AI tools are not reducing headcount to provide leisure. They are drastically increasing output expectations. This relentless workload creep signals a massive long-term risk of systemic corporate burnout and potentially a fierce rise in white-collar unionization as employees push back against that stationary bike.
Wow. And Development 7.
Development 7. Consumer electronics saturation. With smartphone markets contracting over 13% and chip costs surging 40%, the era of automatic, reliable hyper-growth in personal electronics is pausing. Consumers are tapped out, and the hardware upgrade cycle is lengthening significantly.
Which leaves the final theme. How do geopolitics reshape talent and capital?
Exactly. The final theme is the geopolitics of capital flow. Development 8. The permanent shift in global education flows. Stricter visa regimes in the Anglosphere are actively redirecting elite Indian intellectual capital toward the EU, specifically Germany, Spain, and Italy. For an investor, this means the future epicenter of cross-border startups, talent networks, and institutional research is shifting geographically.
That's a big one. Development 9.
Development 9. Domestic space tech as a sovereign growth vector. TIDCO's 25-core investment in Rapti and Agnicol proves that state-sponsored deep tech is now a national security imperative. These sectors will see sustained, uncyclical sovereign capital inflows regardless of market conditions.
And the final one, Development 10.
Development 10. The localization of corporate spend. The shift in India Inc. from massive luxury offsites to hyper-local 1,500 rupee micro-experiences reveals a structural, long-term tightening of corporate discretionary spending. Budgets are being permanently trimmed in favor of low-cost, high-authenticity alternatives.
That is a masterclass in synthesis. The mechanical tension really does transfer from the macro fragility of the Strait of Hormuz directly down to the microeconomics of a corporate pizza-making class. It is a perfectly interlocked system.
It absolutely is.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to the human element trapped inside this massive, grinding clockwork. We're watching artificial intelligence ruthlessly reshape how we think and how hard we are forced to work, while simultaneous geopolitical violence redraws the physical map of what we can afford to buy and where we are allowed to travel.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you navigate your own highly scheduled day. If artificial intelligence is stripping all the natural friction and pauses from our jobs, inadvertently forcing us to pedal faster and harder straight through our lunch breaks, and at the exact same time, geopolitical tensions are making global travel drastically more expensive, logistically daunting, and physically dangerous, will the ultimate luxury of the next decade simply be the right to disconnect entirely? Will the highest, most coveted status symbol of the year 2036 not be the latest AI-integrated smartphone or a first-class ticket to a luxury hotel, but simply the guaranteed, untrackable, legally protected ability to turn the machine completely off, step away from the algorithm, and stare in total silence at a very still pond?
That is a fascinating question.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you on the next one.